welcome to Reformed Thinking. So, um, imagine holding a piece of parchment that is about to drop a massive theological bomb on the absolute center of the pagan world.
Yeah, no casual greetings at all.
Right. No polite small talk to, warm up the room. Just one continuous, unbroken Greek sentence that completely dismantles human pride.
It just drops the reader right before the sovereign throne of God.
It really does. Today, we have a specific mission for you. We're going to unpack the sheer theological weight of just 7 verses. We're looking at Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 7.
And our sources for this deep dive are 2 rigorous, highly dense exegetical texts. They specifically examine the opening of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans.
So let's get into this. We are looking at a document written by a man preparing to send a letter into basically the lion's den.
To really grasp the gravity of what Paul is doing for you as the reader, we have to set the historical stage.
Okay, set the scene for us.
We need to look at where he is standing and where he is looking. The year is AD 57. It is winter.
So he is probably stuck indoors.
Yeah, he is sitting in the bustling pagan seaport of Corinth, and he's being hosted by a man named Gaius.
And Corinth itself is a pretty wild place.
Oh, absolutely, a wild pagan city. But Paul is looking westward. His eyes are fixed on Rome, the imperial capital of the known world.
Right.
And he is writing to a group of people he has never actually met face to face.
Let's talk about the reality of Rome at this specific moment in history.
Right?
Because we are not talking about some quaint ancient town.
Not at all.
Rome is staggering in its scale. We are looking at a metropolis of over 1 million souls.
Which is massive for the ancient world.
Unbelievably huge.
Yeah.
And it is a city defined by a brutal, highly visible social divide. Roughly half of that massive population lived in the degrading bonds of physical slavery.
Yeah, it is a harsh reality.
Plus, it is the absolute apex of military dominance and intellectual pride. We are in the early reign of the Emperor Nero.
That is right.
So the city is just drowning in systemic moral decay, idolatry, and emperor worship. It is an incredibly intimidating place to send a letter.
And it is a terrifying place to live as a Christian. Within that sprawling, hostile environment, you have this small, scattered network of Christian house churches.
They don't have massive buildings or anything, right?
No big buildings, no political influence whatsoever. And worse, they're facing a severe internal crisis.
Like a crisis that threatens to tear them apart from the inside.
Yeah, before the empire even gets a chance to persecute them, they might destroy themselves. We have to rewind the clock just a few years to AD 49.
Okay, what happened then?
The Emperor Claudius issued an edict that expelled all Jews from the city of Rome.
Wait, all of them?
Every single one.
Why would he issue a blanket expulsion like that?
The Roman historian Suetonius records the reason for us. He writes that the expulsion happened because of constant riots in the Jewish quarter over a figure he called Chrestus.
Chrestus. I mean, that is clearly a Roman misspelling or misunderstanding of Christ.
Spot on. The preaching of the gospel was causing such an uproar in the synagogues that the emperor just lost his patience.
He just kicked every Jewish person out of the capital.
Right. So overnight, the Jewish Christians, who were the founders of these little house churches, are forced out of the city.
Okay, that means the entire demographic of the Roman church shifts instantly.
Completely.
For 5 whole years, these house churches become entirely Gentile. The leadership, the style of worship, the cultural assumptions, everything shifts to a Gentile perspective.
It is a massive sociological shift.
Let me try an analogy to make this real for you. Imagine you own a family restaurant.
Okay.
It is a classic Jewish deli. You establish the menu, you set the recipes, you know the regulars.
Right, it has a very specific identity.
Suddenly, the government forces you out of the country for 5 years. You hand the keys to some of your employees who are from a completely different culinary background.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
When you finally get permission to come back 5 years later, you walk through the doors and find they have turned your deli into a barbecue joint.
Wow.
They changed the menu, the decor is totally different, the management structure is new, and they have zero desire to go back to the old way of doing things.
That is an excellent way to picture the tension. Because when Claudius dies in AD 54, the edict is lifted.
So the Jewish Christians get to return to Rome.
Yeah, they walk back into the house churches they originally helped plant, and massive cultural and theological friction erupts.
Because you have Jewish believers who still hold to strict dietary laws, right?
Yes, dietary laws and Sabbath customs. And suddenly they are sharing communion with Gentile believers who eat pork and do not observe the Jewish calendar.
The friction must have been palpable.
Oh, it was. They are judging one another, despising one another, and just fracturing along these cultural lines.
So Paul is sitting in Corinth, writing to this specific fractured group, and he has never even visited them. How does he even attempt to unite them?
He unites them by completely refusing to start with their cultural disputes. He points them entirely away from their differences.
He changes the subject.
He fixes their gaze on a cosmic divine message. He forces them to look up. And he does this by constructing that massive, unbroken opening sentence.
Let's look at the syntactical marvel of this text. If you read standard Greco-Roman letters from the 1st century, the conventions are very brief and predictable.
Very formulaic.
Right. The format is almost always A to B, greetings. The author states their name, names the recipient, and says a quick hello before moving on.
Yeah, very simple.
But Paul completely blows up that convention. He starts to say his name, but he builds this huge nested theological manifesto.
The physical structure of the Greek language Paul employs here is fascinating. He writes his name Paul, but he is so consumed by the reality of his message that he immediately suspends the actual greeting.
It's like he can't even get a hello out without preaching.
Pretty much. He delays the main verb by stacking a cascade of relative clauses, participles, and prepositional phrases.
So from a syntactical perspective, this grammar physically forces the reader's attention away from Paul the man.
Yes. It pulls the attention away from Rome, the city, and funnels all focus directly onto the Son of God.
The syntax actually subordinates the messenger to the message.
That is a great way to put it. He is telling them right from the first drop of ink that this letter is not about his personal authority or their local squabbles.
The literary placement of this theological overture is also brilliant. If you look ahead, right after this greeting, starting in verse 18 and running all the way through chapter 3,
Oh yeah, that section is heavy.
Paul is going to unleash a terrifying description of divine wrath against human sin. He is going to drag all of humanity, Jew and Gentile alike, into the courtroom to expose their total guilt before a holy God.
Every mouth is stopped.
Right. But before he does that, he wraps these Roman believers in sovereign grace. He secures them in the sufficiency of Christ before walking them into the dark valley of human condemnation.
That pastoral strategy guarantees the reader understands that salvation is entirely a divine rescue mission.
Because if he started with the wrath, they might just drown in despair.
Exactly. Spot on. By starting with the absolute triumph of the gospel, he gives them a firm place to stand. And he establishes that reality beginning with the very first word he uses to define his own identity in verse 1.
Let's examine that word. He calls himself a bondslave of Christ Jesus. Think about the shock value of that specific term for the listener in Rome.
It would have hit them hard.
In a city where half the population consists of literal slaves who are treated as disposable property, Paul willingly claims this title.
The sources point out that he specifically rejects more honorable Greek terms he could have used.
Like what?
Like the word for a hired worker or a contractor. A hired worker has rights. They can negotiate their wages, they can quit if they do not like the conditions, and they clock out at the end of the day.
But by choosing the word for slave, Paul is announcing that he has zero personal autonomy. He is bought with a price.
He is claiming total ownership by another. And to the Jewish ear in those Roman house churches, that Greek word carries a massive Old Testament echo.
Oh, what is the connection there?
It translates to the Hebrew phrase, Ebed Yahweh, the servant of the Lord. This was an incredibly high honor.
So it wasn't just a lowly term.
Not to a Jewish listener. It was a title reserved for monumental covenant figures like Moses, Joshua, and David.
So Paul is combining absolute humility with staggering prophetic dignity. He is owned entirely by Christ, but he speaks with the authority of the ancient prophets.
Yeah, it is a brilliant juxtaposition.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back here on behalf of the listener.
Okay, what is the concern?
Today, the concept of being a slave carries horrific, abusive connotations. We associate it with kidnapping, brutality, and the total theft of human dignity.
Understandably so.
So how do we understand this complete loss of autonomy as a positive theological reality? How do we explain this without softening the absolute total submission Paul is claiming?
That is a crucial tension to resolve. Paul answers it with his very next phrase.
What does he say?
After calling himself a slave, he says he is a called apostle. This addresses the specific nature of the master who owns him. Paul's calling was not a volunteer position.
He didn't apply for the job.
Right. He did not evaluate a list of career options and decide that apostleship looked like a good fit. It was a sovereign, effectual summons.
Can you break down what you mean by an effectual summons? Give us an ELI 5, explain it like I'm 5 on mechanics of that. What actually happens in an effectual call?
Think about Paul's history. He was a murderous enemy of the church. He was breathing threats, rushing down the road to Damascus with legal papers to arrest and kill Christians.
He was definitely not seeking God.
No, he was not looking for Jesus. He was actively fighting against him. An effectual call means a monergistic rescue mission.
Monergism meaning one working.
Yes, one working. God initiates and God executes the calling entirely by his own sovereign will without Paul's prior cooperation.
The risen Christ just invaded Paul's reality.
He struck him blind and sovereignly summoned him. The call actually produced the desired effect.
So the loss of autonomy is a positive reality here, because the autonomy Paul lost was driving him straight toward eternal destruction.
Spot on. He was conquered by a master who loves him and rescued him from his own hatred.
That brings up a fascinating linguistic detail from the source material. Paul was conquered, and then he says he is set apart for the gospel.
The irony here is incredible if you know his background.
Right, because the word Pharisee in Hebrew literally translates to the separated ones. And Paul spent his entire early life as a Pharisee.
He spent decades meticulously separating himself from anything unclean.
He fenced himself off with strict legalism. He avoided the shadows of Gentiles. He was tithing the tiny herbs in his garden, just trying to build this massive wall of self-righteousness.
But now God has permanently horizoned him off for the exact opposite reality. The gospel of free grace.
The contract is brilliant.
And the Greek participle he uses for set apart is passive. It proves the action was performed upon him by God.
Paul did not separate himself for this mission.
No, God separated him. His identity is completely wrapped up in a message he did not invent and a calling he did not initiate. He is simply a steward of a divine decree.
If Paul didn't invent this message, where did it come from? And who is the actual subject of the message? Let's move into verses 2 through 4 to see how Paul answers that.
Well, Paul explicitly roots the gospel in ancient prophecy. He uses a specific verb that means promised beforehand.
So the Christian message is no theological novelty.
Not at all. And in the ancient world, especially among Greek philosophers, novelty was prized. People were always looking for the newest idea.
But Paul says the gospel is the climax of the Old Testament covenants. It was promised through the prophets and the Holy Scriptures.
The church is a steward of an objective, historical message that has been unfolding for centuries.
And the center of that historical message is highly specific.
Yeah.
Paul says the gospel is strictly concerning his son.
Yes.
It is not a broad philosophy about human self-actualization. It is not a program for moral uplift or a strategy for social improvement.
It completely refutes what we see today.
Yeah, this totally refutes the modern idea of therapeutic deism. The notion that God exists just to help you feel good about yourself and assist you with your daily problems.
The gospel is entirely about a divine person and what that person accomplished.
Paul gives us a dual description of this divine person, starting with his earthly lineage. He says the Son came from the seed of David according to the flesh.
The specific Greek word used here indicates that the pre-existent, eternal Son of God assumed true humanity.
He entered into historical time.
Yes, taking on flesh and blood to become the legitimate legal heir to the Israelite throne. He is not just a spirit. He has legal rights based on the Davidic covenant.
Then Paul pivots to the second description. He says the Son was installed or declared as the Son of God in absolute dominion according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection for the dead.
This is a massive theological statement.
Wait, hold on. I need to put up a guardrail for the listener here.
Okay, what are we protecting it?
Well, if Paul says Jesus was declared or appointed the Son of God at the resurrection, doesn't that sound like he wasn't the Son of God before that?
Oh, I see the danger.
Are we saying Jesus was just a good human teacher who somehow earned his way to divinity by being obedient?
We must vigorously reject that idea. That is an ancient error known as adoptionism.
Adoptionism, okay.
It is the false belief that God simply adopted a human man and elevated him to divine status. That is not what Paul is saying at all.
So what does the Greek actually mean there?
The Greek term Paul uses here is the word from which we get our English word horizon. It means to establish a boundary, to publicly designate or to vindicate.
So it does not mean acquiring a divine nature he previously lacked.
Absolutely not. The eternal Son who existed before all worlds stepped down into the humiliation of human weakness.
Hmm.
The physical bodily resurrection is the Father's absolute undeniable validation of the Son's substitutionary sacrifice on the cross.
By raising him from the dead, the Father publicly vindicated him.
Yes, he installed the God-man in supreme cosmic dominion as the reigning king.
So the contrast is not that he went from being human to being God.
No.
The contrast is the stages of his messianic work. He went from the humiliation of his earthly ministry, where he suffered and died, to the exaltation of his resurrection reign, where he rules.
That is the perfect way to frame it.
He who was born in the likeness of men now rules with absolute authority over the entire cosmos.
It is a total shift in his functional status as the mediator.
If Christ is actually reigning over the cosmos right now, as Paul just established, then how does that change the way a Roman citizen lives tomorrow morning?
It changes everything.
What does this king actually demand of the nations? That brings us right to verse 5.
In verse 5, Paul introduces the phrase, the obedience of faith. He states that the entire goal of his apostleship across all nations is to bring about this obedience for the sake of Christ's name.
So the mandate is clear. The gospel does not simply ask for intellectual agreement.
No, it does not.
It does not ask you to just nod your head at a list of historical facts. It demands obedient submission.
Our sources point out that this specific phrase dismantles two opposing errors that constantly plague the church.
Let's break those down. What is the first error?
The first error is legalism. This is the false, exhausting idea that human obedience can somehow earn divine favor.
It is the belief that if you just act good enough, if you check all the moral boxes, God is obligated to save you.
Right, which completely nullifies grace. And the second error is equally deadly. It is called antinomianism, which literally means anti-law.
Today, it is often called easy believism, right?
Yes. This is the destructive idea that you can accept Jesus as your Savior to get a ticket to heaven, but entirely reject him as your Lord.
It is the belief that you can say a prayer, claim you have faith, and then continue living however you please in unrepentant sin.
The phrase obedience of faith destroys both of these extremes completely.
Let me offer an analogy to explain how faith and obedience actually interact for you as the listener. Think of the relationship between a fire and the heat it produces.
That is a helpful visual.
Faith is the fire itself. It is the spark of life granted by God. Obedience is the heat that radiates from that fire. You cannot have the fire without the heat.
They're inseparable.
Right. The heat does not create the fire. It is the inevitable physical evidence that the fire actually exists.
Because if you claim to have a blazing fire, but the room is freezing cold, you are deceiving yourself.
A faith that justifies a sinner is never isolated. It necessarily produces a life of active, willing submission to the King. It is like inhaling and exhaling.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanics of salvation, and this connects directly to the doctrine of total depravity.
How so?
We have to understand the condition of the human heart before grace arrives. The human heart, by its very fallen nature, is spiritually dead.
Think of it like a body with completely dead nerve endings.
Or a broken compass that is permanently stuck, pointing away from true north. No matter how hard you shake the compass, it will never point to God.
So a spiritually dead person cannot produce the obedience of faith on their own. They cannot generate the fire.
Therefore, the ability to believe the gospel and the desire to obey Christ is itself a sovereign gift from God.
He grants the new heart.
He strikes the spark to create the fire, and the necessary resulting heat is a posture of glad submission.
If that is the global mandate for all nations, how does that land specifically on the people sitting in the living rooms of Rome listening to this letter being read?
Paul brings this massive, cosmic theological sentence right down into their laps in verses 6 and 7.
He addresses them directly.
He says they are called saints. Just as Paul was a called apostle, rescued on the Damascus Road, they are called people.
The Roman believers are not passive spectators watching a cosmic play unfold. They are the actual trophies of the grace Paul is preaching about.
Notice the possessive nature of his language here. He says they are called to belong to Jesus Christ. Christ has laid a claim on them. They are his property.
There is a striking realization here for the listener. The word saint is not a special title reserved for a tiny elite class of super Christians.
Right, like people who perform miracles or live in monasteries.
Or get statues built in their honor centuries later. In biblical terms, Every single justified believer is a saint.
If you belong to Christ, you are a saint. The word means Holy One. You are entirely consecrated to God.
Recognizing that identity acts as a massive fortress against cultural assimilation. Rome was an overwhelming culture designed to force conformity.
And today, the church faces similar pressures. This holy calling opposes consumer-driven models of religion, seeker-sensitive pragmatism, and any attempt to dilute the hard truths of the gospel just to appease a hostile society.
If you are called by the sovereign Lord of the universe, your allegiance is permanently fixed to his truth. You do not adapt the message to fit the passing fads of the society around you.
Paul wraps up this unbelievable opening sentence by offering an apostolic blessing. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ.
Let's contrast that exact phrase with the physical environment of Rome. The empire constantly boasted of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Oh, the irony of that peace.
Right. But the Pax Romana was the peace of the sword. It was a false peace enforced by military brutality, crushing any opposition into absolute silence.
The message was simple. Submit to Caesar, pay your taxes, or be crucified.
The contrast could not be sharper. The peace of Christ does not rely on military threat.
No, it rests on a permanent historical atonement and a bodily resurrection.
Rome claimed mere subjects through fear and intimidation. Christ calls saints through love and sovereign grace.
Rome demanded that its citizens glorify Caesar as a deity. The true church exists solely to glorify the name of Jesus Christ among all nations, knowing he is the only true king.
Let's summarize the immense terrain we have just covered. We started by looking at a fractured, tense house church divided by cultural disputes in the capital of the pagan world. We watched Paul bypass their local arguments to construct a single, unbroken Greek sentence that strips away all human autonomy and pride.
We saw how this text establishes the dual nature of Christ, the legal heir of David, who is vindicated in cosmic dominion through the physical resurrection.
And we saw how this sovereign king demands an active, obedient faith from a people he has effectually called out of darkness.
If there is one primary takeaway from these 7 verses, it is that this passage leaves absolutely no room for man-centered religion.
Not at all.
It forces the reader to acknowledge that they are not their own. If you have believed this gospel, you belong entirely to a sovereign Lord.
Your salvation was planned in eternity.
Promised by the ancient prophets, accomplished in history by the Son, and applied to your dead heart by sheer grace.
Which leaves you with a final, lingering question to ponder as we close this deep dive.
What is that?
If this single opening sentence establishes that your identity as a called saint is completely secured by God's sovereign initiative, if he started the fire, how does that absolute security change the way you face tomorrow?
It has to change everything.
How does it change the way you read every difficult command, every call to suffer, and every strict moral requirement in the rest of the New Testament?
That is the question.
Does obedience still feel like a heavy, impossible burden? Or does it become the natural reflex of a heart that has finally been brought back to life?